The purpose of the talk this afternoon is to explore the idea of soul consciousness. And we all come into this life with a certain amount of what we might call karmic baggage through previous incarnations. But we also have what I think is an agreed soul purpose or a mission for each particular life. And this really dictates the circumstances of our life, the personality that we adopt for a particular life. Now, many people go through life without any real understanding of what this mission actually is, or even that there is a mission at all. This life purpose that we have, that we come into each life with, isn't dictated by the usually self-centered aspirations and ambitions of the lower personality, the personality we adopt for one particular life, but for higher evolutionary purposes and the aims of the soul. This is very, very important. But with only a minority of people, shall we say, connected to their souls, we don't really understand our true identity. And this, I believe, and I'll try and explain why this is causing perhaps the bulk of problems in the world today. But let me start on personal note, and this might actually resonate with some of you. It probably applies to virtually everybody in the world if we think about it. But as we know, life throws up all sorts of immense challenges and traumas. And occasionally, as some of you will know, it turns into a complete car crash. But all this happens for a reason. And these times of disruption and of turbulence in our lives are just bumpy parts of the soul's onward journey, and they're very necessary parts. Round about 15 years ago, my life descended into one of its periodic crises, and I developed this overwhelming feeling that my life had been complete failure and that I'd achieved absolutely nothing at all. It wasn't true, but this is the way that I felt. It all seemed like an utter waste of time to me. And it left me feeling very, very empty, without meaning and without direction, without purpose or anything like that. When this happened, interestingly, it was at the age of about 58, which is, as the astrological people among you will know, is the second Saturn return. And there's a number of people I know who have reached this particular age, and they're all finding their lives are in a period of transition at the moment as we reach this particular stage. I've come across numerous people for whom this has been the case. So when I reached this point a few years ago, I just got this idea, as many people do from time to time, that their lives are just an abject failure. And I just looked back on it and I couldn't see that I'd actually achieved anything. And sometimes I felt extremely angry about this and quite humiliated. And the other thing that I thought had gone through my life, woven through like a common thread, was this feeling of rejection, not only of being rejected, but of my tendency to reject other people as well. And this was something I felt I really had to deal with. So, in amongst all this toxic cocktail of negativities, guilt and shame and anger and meaninglessness and powerlessness, something dramatic began to happen. And it was quite mysterious in many ways, the process which began to unfold at this time. And things happened which fundamentally changed not only my life, my material circumstances, but also the way I looked on life as well. And I now believe that the events which happened then and the subsequent events which followed and the new people I met were not just chance or accidental or random events, but these were actually meant to happen as if they were part of some plan. And this continuum uh, had to somehow unfold in my life it's almost as if it was predestined in some way. And somehow I'd managed to open myself up to new possibilities. Um, I didn't appreciate this at the time, but it was part of a much wider phenomenon identified by my colleague, Dr. Steve Taylor, who works at Leeds Beckett University. And unusually, he combines psychology with spirituality. And he calls these difficulties in our life, he calls it post-traumatic growth. Now, we all imagine these events are just negative and everything, and that they're just there to cause us distress and pain. But Dr. Taylor says that between 30 and 40% of people actually benefit from these experiences and they actually start to grow, they start to develop new things. People who are alcoholics suddenly stop drinking. People in marital difficulties realize certain things about it. And they start to directly benefit from all the difficulties and the traumas that they've been through. So rather than succumbing to that rather modern popular option of victimhood, which we see played out all around us all the time, um, these people somehow appreciate that the difficulties which they've encountered have taught them an important lesson in life. And as a result, these traumas produce recovery and growth. And so this idea of victimhood, which is so prevalent in the modern world, is just completely the wrong way of dealing with these things. So at this point, my career wasn't really doing very much. I had a lot more time on my hands. And so I began studying all the ageless wisdom again. Now, I've been interested in this stuff since I was a teenager and made a futile attempt at the age of 17 to read The Secret Doctrine. I probably only got about 40 pages into it before I gave up. But I revisited this again after a career as a journalist and all sorts of other activities which tend to preclude you from doing this sort of thing. And I hadn't had much time then for more metaphysical stuff, but now I did. And suddenly this all seemed to me more important than anything else which I'd done before. And then came a life-changing event. I joined the Theosophical Society and I began to immerse myself in its ideas and its many very, very long books. And it quickly became apparent to me that all this fascinating stuff that I was reading and studying wasn't actually new to me at all. It seemed strangely familiar in some ways. It was as if I'd heard all this before. Perhaps I'd been a theosophist in a previous life or some equivalent of theosophy. But where? Where was this? Perhaps as Plato suggested wisely, all knowledge is simply remembering those things experienced in previous lives. So from the very start, theosophy for me wasn't just dead or dry theory, which was entirely divorced from everyday reality. For me, it was a very vibrant, comprehensive, and panoramic philosophy, which could be practically applied to everyone's everyday life. And as I say, I'm a very practical man, and I like stuff that will help me to improve the way I live. because that's what theosophy is. It's not just a theory, it's a way of living. Although I have to confess that I haven't always been able to conform to all its dietary requirements, but I do try. So, gradually, as I absorbed this wisdom knowledge and plowed through all these dozens of articles and books, more and more pieces of this jigsaw started falling together. And over a relatively short period of time, the way I'd previously regarded myself and the wider world began to change quite dramatically. Without warning and without wanting to overstate it, my entire consciousness and worldview was changing. And that helped me to put things into a new kind of perspective. Possibly the first major breakthrough was when I began to realize that success and failure aren't just the neat binary opposites that we consider them to be. They're two sides of the same coin, but this isn't an either or. They're just part and parcel of the same process. And since they're relative and since they're interdependent, they're actually impossible to define. For example, a success may have been preceded by 100 failures, and any success may be followed by 100 more failures. Uh, so suddenly realized that success can't be defined by material wealth, because that's largely how we tend to define success in the modern world, by power, position, prestige, the owning of possessions, etc., etc. It's much more relative and it's much more nuanced than that. Gaining knowledge, gaining wisdom, and gaining experience seem to me much more important than acquiring a bank balance or a yacht, although I wouldn't particularly mind either. Um, I'd had in my life, due to being a journalist, a lot of varied experiences and acquired a certain amount of knowledge from all sorts of different people. And this realization not only had a rejuvenating effect on me, but it completely transformed my whole attitude and outlook to things. Perhaps failure, thought, perhaps failure was an essential precursor to success, a vital ingredient in that process in some way. And perhaps success and failure were just two aspects of the same thing, so saying. And I was aware that a lot of people regarded themselves as failures in this modern world, just as I had. And so I wanted to communicate these ideas to other people because I thought it might help them, people who labored under the same misapprehensions as I had. And so I wrote this talk and later an article called How to Be a Complete Success at Failure. And that resonated with a lot of people. It even made some people laugh, although I know esotericists are not always too strong on humor, but there we are. Um, so when I started looking at this stuff, it seemed to be very, very comprehensive. It all seemed to be very persuasive. And I think it's always useful to to remind ourselves of what these principles in theosophy are. So briefly, everything in the universe is connected, alive, and conscious. The material plane is just one of many dimensions. Humans are more than just physical beings. Everything is about evolution into higher forms, whichever kingdom of nature we belong to. And that evolution proceeds in long and sometimes short cycles. And all this is part of a grand plan for humanity and for all those kingdoms of nature. I found also that human beings rise and fall through their own actions. And if we wish, if we try hard enough, we can be masters of our own destiny. And more crucially than perhaps all of that, evolution involves continual birth and rebirth in different bodies, in different eras, in different circumstances. And this last idea of physical death not being the end of the line, but the start of a new journey, absolutely fascinated me. At this point, or some point prior to this, my father had died. He'd been extremely frightened when he died. And this had provoked a certain interest in death to me, and I began to study it quite a lot. Although I'd actually believed in reincarnation since I was about 8 years old, and I had this strange experience in the school classroom as my friends were playing football. I just withdrew, and I just had this overwhelming feeling that I'd been here before. I didn't mean in that playground, but on this earth before. And despite 2 decades and many decades of the corrosive effects of journalism, where journalists don't really believe in anything very much, started, I retained this idea of death and rebirth. And as I studied death and rebirth and what happens between lives, I began to have other, what I thought were very important realizations. The chief one being the supreme importance and the guiding influence of the law of cause and effect, or karma. And this taught me a number of things as well. In the words of the Bible, whatever you sow, you will reap. In colloquial language, what goes around comes around. And that every thought and action and word and deed and emotion has its consequences somewhere down the line, very possibly in future lives. And most importantly, that nothing happens by chance, by accident. There's no such thing as fate or luck. It happens because events have occurred previously to make it happen. As I drilled into this further, I had other ideas. Firstly, that each and every one of us comes into each new life with what I've called a soul purpose. This could be lessons to be learned, knowledge to be acquired, wrongs to be righted, experiences to be had, services to be rendered, and people to meet. Secondly, that although human beings have a degree of free will, that none of us operate in a vacuum, but as part of a wider continuum involving other people. So during my researches into death, which ultimately culminated in my book, Everyone's Book of the Dead, and my recent film, The Myth of Death, I'd become intrigued by many attempts to investigate individuals' past lives. And I started studying the very many accounts of past lives gained through things such as past life regression, which, as I'm sure you're aware, involves hypnotizing individuals and guiding them back into previous lives. They've been doing this since the 1950s, and apart from anything else, it has incredibly therapeutic effects on people. Now, some years ago, before I became a theosophist, I actually underwent 3 of these past life regression sessions, and they were absolutely fascinating. I was a metals trader in ancient Lebanon. I was a middle-aged monk. I was the wife of a knight. I was a soldier in the Second World War. I was the wife of a famous French novelist as the Eiffel Tower was being constructed. And there were other insights as well. So it would seem that after reaching a certain degree of spiritual development, human beings can, to a greater or lesser extent, choose the conditions of their next physical life, the environment, the circumstances, and the era, as well as choosing one's own parents. there's a popular saying, isn't it? Oh, you can't choose your own parents, but apparently we do. I know it's a horrifying thought to some people. Uh, and there is in all these things a kind of a divine logic and justice which seems to prevail, whether we like it or not. Perhaps before people attain a certain degree of development, they do need to be assisted by higher beings to advise them what kind of life they need to leave next. So each life is chosen, it seems, with pre-agreed plan or soul contract. And another thing which struck me from the very start was that the idea that reincarnating numerous times isn't just about the evolution of one's own soul, because karma, the law of cause and effect, doesn't just operate on individuals. Uh, it doesn't operate on individuals in isolation. There's also something called collective karma, and this is the karma of groups, of nations, of organizations, and even entire civilizations. The evidence from tens of thousands of these past life regression sessions over the past 6 decades shows overwhelmingly that human beings are also part of soul collectives or groups of souls who are continually reborn together to interact in different roles. And so it would seem that the time and the place of a person's rebirth may be contingent on those of others. However, this is extremely mysterious and very, very complicated. Now, these soul groups are not to be confused with the group souls, which prevail in the animal kingdom, because animals have yet to acquire individualized souls, and we're told that that won't happen now again in this fourth round, not until the next round. And in these human soul groups, it's almost as if their members are playing out some kind of prearranged karmic script in which old issues have to be resolved and conflicts have to be harmonized. Perhaps new possibilities and new dynamics can be opened up through these interactions. The workings of these groups often appear to take place in family settings, where the same souls repeatedly reincarnate together, and where the roles continually change from husband to daughter to grandmother, etc., etc. Those involved may also appear in other roles as close friends or sworn enemies, business associates, or united by other common interests. So, understanding one's own karma without the knowledge of past lives is challenging enough, if not largely impossible for most people. Unraveling the complexities of group or collective karma, therefore, represents yet another quantum leap. But just because we can't understand it, it doesn't invalidate group karma, and understanding that it does exist really helps to create a new perspective on these things. So when you see that stranger across the street and you feel immediately attracted to them or instantly repelled, perhaps you're encountering a soul that you recognize from a previous life, a soul now occupying another body and displaying a different personality. But it's that person's soul nature you recognize that you are attracted to or repelled by, not the outward trappings of the personality. So could they be part of your soul group, I wonder? Well, since life isn't random, purposeless, or accidental, we can assume that there is some sort of grand overarching plan for the earth, its kingdoms of nature, and for each and every one of us. Therefore, we can assume that each life does have that special mission or soul purpose, which I mentioned a little earlier on. The difficulty here is that many people, especially those of an ultra materialistic mindset, don't accept the fact that they have a soul in the first place. And even amongst those who do believe they have a soul, how many are aware that in each life the soul has that specific purpose? Well, I'm no statistician, but I imagine that we're talking, very small numbers here. But it's important to point out that accepting the existence of a soul at all represents a great spiritual leap forward for most people because it represents an uplift in consciousness. Many people don't realize until comparatively late in their lives what the soul purpose is. And many of them then believe that they're far too old to do very much or indeed anything about it. But it's never too late. It's never too late. Why? Because that realization of a soul purpose alone represents another uplift in consciousness. And as we all know, such uplifts are effectively progressive initiations into something higher. So identifying, cooperating with, and fulfilling this soul mission can have another far-reaching effect. By definition, it affirms, of course, the existence of a soul which travels on from life to life and growing from the unique pains and pleasures of material existence. But more than that, it means that a person is actively connecting with and exploring that soul. And this is also the culmination of usually a very prolonged and arduous process. Before connecting with that soul, the necessary pathways have to be created and opened up. A bridge between the lower temporary personality and the higher eternal individuality has to be forged in some way. In Theosophy, we refer to this as the rainbow bridge or the antakarana. The personality, with its mainly desire-driven aims, is often in direct conflict with the individuality and its more noble aspirations. The soul and the personality, with their opposing agendas, are frequently at war with each other. And this explains a lot about human behavior, past and present. Securing a peace treaty between these two warring factions is often the first challenge on anyone's spiritual journey, and this is far from easy. This will often test people to the very depths and breadths of their endurance. And for many, they will be able to do this, and it will represent a ceasefire, which hopefully is permanent, but may only be temporary. So let's pose a question. How many people do we think are soul connected? Well, of course, it's a question without any definitive answer. After all, there isn't database or anything for such things as this. But when you discuss this with people who have esoteric interests, you can find perhaps some sort of crude consensus. The figures these people come up with generally range from 5 to 15% of individuals who've attained some kind of soul connection. Now, whether these figures are accurate, I don't know. And as I'm acutely aware, there are many, including some in this room, who believe that number of people connected to their souls is far, far less than this. But let's be optimistic, shall we? But relatively small numbers of people, often key individuals, can and do effect momentous and monumental change. So it doesn't take a world where everyone's connected to their souls to achieve anything. Um, there are assertions that it takes only 1, 2, maybe 5% of people to collectively change a situation. However, it may be even far fewer than this. The transcendental meditation movement, which emerged in the 1960s, discovered that when they set up centers in different places, it took only a tiny number of people to be able to affect change. They found that, in fact, it was the square root of 1% of any given population. The square root of 1% of the world's population at the moment is a mere 9,000 people. So change can come from relative, I mean, that's Theosophical Society has more members than that, so we can change the world. Um, those people who are brave and enduring enough to have opened up this highway between body and soul represent a kind of spiritual vanguard for humanity. Um, they've become tasked with steering mankind's onward development and our ascent, hopefully. And all this indicates that people are at staggeringly different stages of spiritual as well as emotional and mental development. And this, of course, is also because some souls are far older than others and therefore have benefited from more incarnations. Some old souls first individualized into human form on a previous planetary scheme. The moon chain, which by all accounts and for various reasons was a failure and abandoned by the then planetary logos, and life transferred to the present Earth scheme. And this is where younger souls from souls first individualized from the animal kingdom. So we have two separate groups of people here. So it would appear then that older souls are far more likely to have developed a connection between their lower and higher selves. Although, as with all things, there will be some exceptions. Connecting with soul consciousness should lie at the very top of the human agenda, but of course it doesn't. We're far too busy with work, sex, leisure, sport, and acquiring things that we don't need for all that. And because of this, human beings now face fundamental identity crisis, which I believe underpins most other crises here on Earth, and God only knows there are many of them. So the core underlying problem is that we don't know who we are. We don't accept the fact, as Teilhard de Chardin put it, that we are humans undergoing a spiritual experience, not human beings who happen to have a soul attached to them in some ways. We are fundamentally soul-based entities. So that old adage by the Greek philosopher Socrates, man, know thyself, rings as true today as when he first uttered it 24 centuries ago. And yet the rump of humanity remains as ignorant of its real identity as it did during those glory days of Greece. When and if we start obeying the soul's commands rather than the rather crude and desire-fueled diktats of the lower personality, then we'll have genuinely turned a corner. And I do believe that growing numbers of people are discovering and experiencing soul consciousness, at least periodically. And human beings are actually evolving spiritually more rapidly than many people would accept. So perhaps this is the universe responding to the clockwork cosmos and mechanistic universe we've wrongly imagined and for so long created, and which of course has nothing to do with Isaac Newton. Maybe this is all a reaction against the overwhelmingly materialistic mindset which still prevails, along with the dark forces which thrive so abundantly in the cloying and negative environment this mindset creates. The ageless wisdom tradition, as epitomized by the Theosophical movement, provides a route map for the transformation of human consciousness, which, in my opinion at least, no other philosophy, science, or religion offers so completely and comprehensively. It provides, again, in my opinion, panoramic superstructure of physical and non-material worlds, mysterious forces, and hidden dimensions that most people don't believe in. And this wisdom recognizes that it's the enduring soul and not the here today, gone tomorrow personality, which is a human being's true identity. So when and if we start appreciating this crucial truth about our soul identity, everything changes. We change. And when we change, the world changes. There's much pessimism haunting this world today. And as we occupy, spectator seats in what many believe will be some sort of impending Armageddon and dystopian future, I don't believe that. I think all the hallmarks are there for it to happen, but I think it can be prevented. And certainly the media and the entertainment industry have done a great deal in recent decades to reinforce these grim and apocalyptic scenarios of devastated and depleted landscapes and poisoned rivers and seas and end-to-end wars. And you can't blame people for fearing the future when fear is used as the linchpin of virtually all these different scenarios. Some years ago, a friend of mine who had psychic abilities told me that one day she'd had a message from me from what she called the other side, wherever that may be. And this message was, fear can't be justified under any circumstances. Well, it's easy enough to say, isn't it? And it certainly perplexed me for a long time, this. And to some extent, it still does. But I know it's true. It's true, but very difficult to achieve. And yet, fear is everywhere, all around us. It's a kind of, how would you call it, a common currency almost. It's something which pervades our modern world, and it's used remorselessly by miscellaneous manipulators for political, social, or commercial reasons. We fear illness, bankruptcy, homelessness, redundancy, hunger, getting old. We fear war, global warming, climate change, pollution, and world domination by sinister corporate elites and extremely weird billionaires. Why am I talking about fear? Because the soul has no fear. Why should it? The soul is on a long evolutionary rite of passage, graduating via lower kingdoms of nature, and one day, in the far distant future, will be heading for superhuman status in some form. Not next week, not next month, not next year, but sometime. And it has ultimately nothing to fear, although the personality to which it's conjoined often lives a life of complete trepidation. When you think about it, fear and desire are very close animal cousins. Fear arises from the lower animal desire-driven mind, where the bulk of humanity spends the bulk of its time. So negotiating this path from the lower mind and the self to its higher counterparts is an arduous journey. It has to be. And it will have its setbacks and disappointments and times of apparent failure. And it's particularly difficult to quell that lower, chattering monkey mind, as we call it, in the modern, bustling, overcrowded, conflict-ridden, and very noisy world that we live in. And I think it can only be done by doing something that Theosophy talks a lot about, and that's about going inward in some way, because this is where the answers are to be found, deep within ourselves and not somewhere out there with a guru on a mountaintop. We all have access to potential treasure troves of knowledge and inner wisdom sealed in our own personal vaults. But the issue is that most people don't know that they have this innate capacity or knowledge, and they can hardly access it if they don't know it's there in the first place. Let's look at the world around us. Our education system, many religions tell us that we are worthless and nothing. Theosophy tells us that we are gods in the making, and this is the route I think we should be going down. So it could be the case that connecting with soul consciousness is mankind's collective and social sole purpose at this time. And maybe this idea of connecting with the soul is the most important imperative for mankind at this time. Thank you.